Hello, everyone. This is Jeff at Mississippi in the Civil War. I hope everyone is having a great start to the new year. It's 2022, and I'm hoping for great things this year. It can't be any worse than 2021, so I'm going to be optimistic so far. And I thought I would start off the year by doing something I've wanted to do for a while, and that's introduce the viewers to some of the published accounts written by Mississippians during the war or after the war. And I thought I would start with one of my favorites, the rank and file at Vicksburg, which was a article written by James Henry Jones for the publications of the Mississippi Historical Society, Volume 7, which was published in 1903. And I came to be acquainted with this work when I was working on my regimental history of the 38th Mississippi Infantry. James Henry Jones had started off as a captain in the 38th Mississippi. By the end of the war, he was lieutenant colonel of the regiment, and he wrote quite a lot about his service with the 38th Mississippi. And I think one of his best accounts is the rank and file at Vicksburg, which goes into great detail about the regiment's service during the siege of Vicksburg. And he was a very good writer. He really brings home the effect that the war had on the individual soldiers, and that's what I like. I really like. I love the accounts by just individual enlisted men and officers. Much more so than reading about generals and that sort of account. I like the stories from the men who were in the trenches and were fighting the battles firsthand. So this is going to be just a brief overview of this work, and I will also at the end give you a link to where you can actually find this article online. And first, I need to give you a little background on Jones. And James Henry Jones, he wrote most of his articles for the newspapers, and this is a good example. This is just a brief mention of him, and he also did a lot of talks around Mississippi. He was a very popular speaker, so he did a lot of went all over the state giving talks. He was also a politician, so I'm sure that played into it as well. Politicians always looking to get on the good side of the voting population. So going around the state and telling these stories about his service, I'm sure also helped in his capacity as a politician after the war. But just to give you a little background on Jones himself, James Henry Jones was born on October 9th, 1836 in Alabama. He was the oldest of 7 children born to John and Mary Jones. And while he was still a very small child, he moved with his family to Mobile. But after the death of his father, the family ended up settling in Macon County, Alabama. In 1856, Jones entered the University of Mississippi, and this is a picture of some of the students at the University of Mississippi taken right before the war. In fact, this would have been just about the time that Jones was at the University of Mississippi. He soon proved himself to be an excellent student. He graduated in the class of 1858, ranked first out of 56 students in that class. Jones then moved to Woodville, Mississippi, where he began the study of law with the firm of Gordon and Barber, one of the leading firms in Wilkinson County. And while living in Woodville, Jones married Helen M. Davis, and after he passed the bar, the young couple moved to Bastrop, Texas. At the outbreak of war in 1861, however, Jones decided to return to Woodville, and he joined the Mississippi Militia as a private for 60 days service under Brigadier General James L. Alcorn. And after this duty was completed, Jones went back to Wilkinson County and began recruiting his own company to serve in the Confederate Army. This company was organized on April 1st, 1862 at Woodville, and they were known as the Wilkinson Guards, and they would become Company D of the 38th Mississippi Infantry. And this is a picture of a member of the Wilkinson Guards, probably taken pretty early in the war. This is John Franklin DeLoach, who was a private in the Wilkinson Guards. But they became part of the 38th Mississippi Infantry in early May 1862 when the regiment was organized. And after the Battle of Corinth, which was the 38th Mississippi's first major fight, they've seen a little bit of action at Iuka, not much. Corinth was their first major fight in October 1862. They were then, after the Battle of Corinth, transferred to a brigade commanded by General Lewis Hebert from Louisiana. And the Hebert's brigade was not involved in any of the fighting that took place prior to the siege of Vicksburg. They were stationed at Snyder's Bluff, just north of Vicksburg. And so when the victorious Federals began to sweep the Confederates in front of them after winning the battles of Raymond, Jackson, Champion Hill, and Big Black River, Hebert's brigade was ordered into the siege lines and charged with defending the part of the entrenchments between the Graveyard Road, which you can see right here labeled as the Cemetery Road, and they were in the entrenchments between the Graveyard Road and the Jackson Road, which you can see right down here. But they were in the part of the lines just south of the Stockade Redan. And this picture you can see, which was taken in the early 1900s, was taken from up on top of the Stockade Redan. And in the introduction to his article, The Rank and File at Vicksburg, Jones explained why he wrote his reminiscences of the siege. And he said, "The siege of Vicksburg, one of the most memorable in the annals of modern warfare and far-reaching in its results, has passed into history. But this history has been written of it as a whole, and the viewpoint of the elevated rank as it should be. I now propose to write of it in its details, as we of the rank and file saw it and shared in it, and I hope to present some incidents worthy of preservation. A great battle is made up of many varied events, of many component parts. Each brigade and each regiment is more or less an independent factor in it, and these must be studied in detail to understand properly what a battle is." And then Jones also noted in his introduction, "I do not propose to write of general results, but to confine myself to the breastworks, in which some of us spent 40 days and 40 nights under a downpour of lead and iron." And he's very much correct. You really do need to study the individual regiments and the individual brigades to really understand a battle completely. Because a battle is going to be different for every unit that fought in it, depending on where they were, who was opposing them, what the terrain was like. And you really need to read these first-hand accounts if you want to understand the battle from the enlisted man's and the perspective. And this is just a great shot. This is not the 38th Mississippi. Unfortunately, there are no wartime pictures of an entire company like this picture. This is actually Company K of the 4th Georgia Infantry, but it's just a good representation of a Confederate company in the field. And the siege of Vicksburg began on May 18th, 1863. And Jones wrote about the beginning of the siege in his work. He said, "On the evening of May 18th, Forney's division took the position assigned to it in the defenses around Vicksburg." And the 38th Mississippi, they were Hebert's brigade, Forney's division. And in fact, this photograph is one I took a few years ago showing the position that the 38th Mississippi initially held in the siege lines. But he went on to say, "Hebert's brigade, of which my regiment was a member, held the fortifications from the Cemetery Road south, across the Jackson Road, and immediately in the rear of the city. In front of us, the timber had been cut down for several hundred yards. About sunset, the enemy appeared in the edge of the woods, and soon after a shell was fired at our position. This was probably the first shot fired during the siege. I heard no other that evening." And I have to say, the terrain looks very different today. whereas it would have been completely cleared in front of the regiment during the siege. Today, it is heavily overgrown with trees, and you really can't even see what much of anything of the terrain in front of the 38th Mississippi. So it looks very different today than it would have during the siege. And then the first major attack on the Vicksburg defenses took place the next day on May 19th, and Jones wrote about this attack. He said, "During the evening of the 19th, after a sharp cannonade, an assault was made upon our front, which was easily repulsed with heavy loss to the enemy, but with little to us. The result of this attack must have been disappointing to General Grant. General Grant did not know or did not consider that Forney's division, which held the weakest part of the Confederate line, had taken no part in the previous campaign and were fresh troops, as were others, and that the survivors of that campaign, although defeated, were not demoralized." And the 38th Mississippi would have been up in this position right up in here, just south of the Stockade Redan. And the May 19th assault was beaten back fairly easily with very light casualties to the 38th Mississippi, and with fairly heavy casualties to the attacking Federals. Yeah, and Grant unfortunately was going to make a second attack before he realized just how stout the defenses were, and how his thoughts on the demoralization of the Confederates might not be correct. And Jones wrote about the second attack, which is on May 22nd. He said, "The failure of his first attack did not convince or discourage General Grant, and he made more elaborate preparations for another and more formidable assault. Before daylight on the 22nd, the enemy began a tremendous cannonade on our front. It was the grandest and most awe-inspiring scene I ever witnessed. The air was ablaze with burning and bursting shells, darting like fiery serpents across the sky, and the earth shook with the thunderous roar. I do not hesitate to assert that coarse print could have been read by the light of those blazing missiles. It would appear almost incredible that but little harm was done by such a fierce cannonade, but so it was. A ditch is almost a perfect protection against a shell fired across it, provided one sits against the side next to the battery. Its momentum carries even the fragments of an exploded shell forward, and there is little danger from it. It is only when messengers of death are dropped from above, or when they enfilade a line of breastworks, that they get in their deadly work." And again, the 38th Mississippi was in the same position for the May 22nd assault, just south of the Stockade Redan. And Jones did go into more detail about the Federal assault on his position. And he said, "When the cannonade ceased, the Federals formed 3 lines of battle near the woods and began a steady advance upon our works. Their lines were about 100 yards apart. They came on as rapidly as the fallen timber would permit and in perfect order. We waited in silence until the first line had advanced within easy rifle range, when a murderous fire was opened from the breastworks. We had a few pieces of artillery, which plowed their ranks with destructive effect. Still they never faltered, but came bravely on. It was indeed a gallant sight, though an awful one. As they came down the hill, one could see them plunging headlong to the front, and as they rushed up the slope to our works, they invariably fell backwards as the death shot greeted them. And yet the survivors never wavered. Some of them fell within a few yards of our works. If any of the first line escaped, I did not see them. They came into the very jaws of death and died. Surely no more desperate courage than this could have been displayed by mortal men." And this is the kind of scene that Jones is talking about. And after a mauling, is really the only way to describe it, that lasted about 45 minutes, the survivors of Ransom's brigade, which were the Federal troops that were attacking the 38th Mississippi's position, they were withdrawn, ending all of the action on the regiment's front. A short time later, Colonel Preston Brent, the commander of the 38th Mississippi, was ordered to move his regiment to the left flank to reinforce the 36th Mississippi, which was in the Stockade Redan. And Grant acknowledged after this attack that Vicksburg cannot be taken by direct assault as he had thought it could be, and he decided to begin siege operations to basically starve the Confederates out. And for the 38th, the siege of Vicksburg was now going to become a very long and very deadly waiting game in the trenches, with the threat of death almost a constant companion. And one result of the May 22nd assault was a huge number of casualties out in front of the 38th Mississippi's position. And Jones wrote about this, and he said, "In front of our regiment, the Federal dead were strewn thickly where they fell. No attempt was made to bury them until the evening of the 25th, when General Pemberton asked for a truce for that purpose. General Grant's action in the matter has always been incomprehensible to me. His dead lay for part of 4 days decaying under a burning sun. The stench was unbearable. The sight was horrible. The reeking bodies lay all blackened and swollen, and some of them with arms extended as if pleading to heaven for the burial that was denied them by man." And I can only imagine what that must have been like. It must have been truly horrible to see all of those dead and dying men just laying out there and having to endure that. It must have just been terrible. And then Jones went on to write, "After that, General Grant settled down to a regular siege, and no further attempt was made to take the city by assault. For several weeks the garrison lived the routine life of a siege, but with us it was by no means a dull routine. The thunder of the cannon greeted us by day and by night, the sharp crack of the rifle, the hiss of the minie-ball, somebody wounded, somebody dying, all the time." And that's the way it was. I mean, there would have been sharpshooting and cannonading literally from sunup to sunset, and then also at night. So it was, death was a constant threat, and there was no respite from it for 40 straight days. And all the while they're exposed to the elements. Now, life got more interesting for the 38th Mississippi on June 2nd, when the regiment was ordered to take a new section of the entrenchments just to the right of the 3rd Louisiana Redan on the Jackson Road. And this is a wartime picture taken just after the siege, and this is taken from the Federal lines. This is their covered approach up to the front lines, and just on the opposite side here would have been the 3rd Louisiana Redan and the 38th Mississippi's position. And the Federals also at this spot built a tower out of railroad ties that they could climb up into and actually see down into the Confederate works and shoot at the Confederates, making the 38th Mississippi's position extremely dangerous. And as they filed into their new position under cover of darkness, Eliezer Thornhill, who was a member of Company E of the 38th Mississippi, heard someone mutter, "Boys, you will smell hell here." And this prediction proved to be very accurate. The line of the entrenchments that the 38th Mississippi was now responsible for defending was very exposed to Union artillery. You also had what was known as Coonskin's Tower, so the Federals could actually shoot down into their trenches. Their regiment's casualties were going to be extrememe high now that they had taken over this new spot. And here's a close-up illustration giving a better view of this tower. And you can see how it just looks down into the Confederate works. So the men in the 38th had to be extremely careful because they were even the slightest movement or lifting of your head could expose you to Federal sharpshooter fire. And this is a modern photo showing the 38th Mississippi's position, which ran along this side of the Jackson Road. And this is the old Jackson Road leading into Vicksburg, and this is the 3rd Louisiana Redan to the left. And Captain Jones said of this new position that they were ordered to hold, he wrote, "This position was probably the most difficult of defense in the entire line, and it was constantly and vigorously assailed all the time. The enemy approached the fort and the point where our own line crossed the Jackson Road by means of saps until a common breastwork lay between us. Every day hand grenades were thrown across from one side to the other, often with fatal results. It had the appearance of a ball game, only the players never caught the balls, but fled from them. And that was very common during the siege. Soldiers on both sides would take small cannonballs, usually 6 or 12 pounders, light the fuse and toss it over into the Federal or Confederate works. They were that close together. By the time the siege ended, the Federal works were literally right up against the 38th Mississippi's position. So it's hard to imagine, but they were literally they were close enough they could talk. And they did. They would often kid each other and joke. It would have been an amazing thing to see. And in fact, it was pretty common at night when the fighting died down for Union and Confederate soldiers to actually meet together. And Jones said of this, on the right of my regiment, the Federal lines were about 100 yards down the hill, and every night Johnny and Yank would call a truce and meet between the lines in a friendly intercourse. And thus the 38th and the 17th Illinois, which was the Federal regiment opposite them, soon became good friends. On parting, the boys would shake hands and caution each other in all seriousness to keep heads down after daylight, when they would shoot at each other's heads with the eagerness of sportsmen. This practice seems to have been common all along the line. And this would have been extremely difficult for me. It's for one thing to fight kind of a nameless enemy, but to actually meet them while the siege is going on, to get to know them personally, and then have to go back to your lines and try and kill the person you were just joking and sharing a hardtack with. That would have been difficult. I don't know how those guys did it. It was a strange war. And then Jones went on to write as the siege progressed about how the effects that it had on the men. He said, day by day as the siege progressed, it was the sole business of the soldier to kill or be killed. Day by day some friend or comrade died, and who's next was on every man's lips and in every man's heart, only to be answered by the thud of a bullet or the crash of a shell. The mental strain became awful under such conditions. I know that the men would have gladly relieved it by rushing over the works and settling the harrowing question of life or death with the bayonet. And he also explained that the 38th Mississippi, even though they were in trenches, they were at somewhat of a disadvantage because of their position. And he wrote, even in the matter of sharpshooting, we were at a great disadvantage because our works were located above those of our foes. One would think this gave us an advantage, but it was not so. The firing was done through portholes, and ours being depicted against the sky revealed the sharpshooters instantly and exposed them to the fire of their opponents. Those of the Federals, on the other hand, were invisible and could not be easily located. To use these ports meant instant death, and the men preferred to stand up boldly and fire over the breastworks at the enemy and risk the chances of return fire. And what he's talking about was they were down in a trench, and every trench had what was known as a headlog up on top, and then they would cut out small ports up under from the dirt up under the logs to fire through. So you had head protection when you shot. But seeing as they were higher up than the Federals that were shooting back at them, when they looked through those holes, it kind of silhouetted them against the background blue sky. So it really put them at a significant disadvantage when it came to returning fire. And then Jones also touched on another problem the Confederates had as the siege wore on, and that was the diminishing food supply. And Jones said, in addition to our other troubles, the commissary department was in a bad condition. At first we had a scanty ration of cornbread and beef, and finally were regaled on pea bread of a most villainous invention of General Pemberton's, and even this was measured out in ounces. I was credibly informed that this bread consisted of ground cowpeas, a little cornmeal, a little salt, and water, and it was baked long enough to cover it with a crust sufficient to hold it together. Inside it was an arid, raw, glutinous mass which we were forced to swallow nightly. That is, those who survived. The dead escaped this affliction. I've never read anybody who had anything good to say about pea bread. It was awful from every account I've read. And the 38th, being right next to the 3rd Louisiana Redan, were also involved in one more significant assault. On the evening of June 25th, the enemy who had been tunneling under the 3rd Louisiana Redan, they packed black powder into a hole that they had dug up under the 3rd Louisiana Redan, and on the 25th they exploded it. And they then made an assault into the crater that was formed by the explosion. And Captain Jones wrote about this assault. He said, on the 25th of June, the enemy blew up the fort occupied by the 3rd Louisiana, immediately on our left. Troops that were massed just outside charged through the crater thus made and attempted to capture the Confederate works. But the gallant Louisianians had thrown up temporary works in the rear of the fort and met the assaulting column and held it in check until reinforcements arrived. It was here that Colonel Irwin, a grandson of Henry Clay, was killed while leading his Missourians into the breach. This defense was a most desperate one, and it was most desperately maintained, and it saved Vicksburg for the time. It was a bloody hand-to-hand fight over a common earthwork. And he's very right. The fighting went on there for, I think, almost 24 hours before the Federals finally gave it up as a lost cause and pulled their men back. But it was some of the bloodiest fighting of the Vicksburg siege. And unfortunately, Jones was to have his own personal tragedy during the siege. His younger brother, he had 3 younger brothers that were in his company, but one of his brothers, John E. Jones, was killed during the siege. And he wrote about this and said, on the 30th of June, I was absent from the works for the first time to bury a brother who was killed. The gallant boy still sleeps in the city he died to defend. While in the city, I was amazed to meet everywhere refined, delicate ladies ministering to the sick and wounded, and perfectly indifferent to the shells. Admiral Porter was constantly raining upon the devoted city. There was something peculiarly unnerving about these huge missiles. They appeared to climb to the zenith slowly, and reaching their highest point, would come crashing down with a noise that was simply appalling. And Jones is he's buried in the Vicksburg City Cemetery to this day. This is a modern picture of his grave. And this is the notation from his service record, just simply stating that he was killed at Vicksburg June 30th. And this was not going to be the last tragedy that Captain Jones had during the course of the war, but and I'll speak on that in a little bit. But this was his Jones was the oldest son. John was the next oldest. He was about 21 at the time of his death. And the siege went on until early July, and Jones noted something unusual on July 3rd. He said, on the morning of July 3rd, an officer in full excuse me. On the morning of July 3rd, an officer in full uniform, mounted on a gray horse and attended by a courier, appeared suddenly on the right of our regiment. He was promptly fired upon by the Federals, who were just down the hill in his front. The courier had neglected to display his flag, which was still rolled up on the staff. It was General Bowen, the hero of Port Gibson. After that, the firing ceased on both sides. In the evening, a group of officers, Union and Confederate, met under an oak tree on our right front, where the cannon now stands. Shortly afterwards, 2 of them separated themselves from the group and walked up the hill towards our lines and seated themselves side by side. I knew General Pemberton and recognized General Grant by the descriptions I had seen of him. He was dressed in a plain uniform that had seen service, while General Pemberton's was new and elegant. They sat thus for about an hour. When they arose, they returned to the group under the tree. We knew then that Vicksburg had fallen. The wonder it held out so long. The troops were so weak from starvation that they staggered like drunken men as they walked. And he's right about the 38th Mississippi had a bird's eye view of the surrender. It literally took place just down the hill from their position. And then the surrender being worked out, it actually took place on July 4th. And Jones said of the actual surrender, he said, on the morning of the 4th of July, the anniversary of the nation's birthday, the garrison of Vicksburg marched out of the works it had so heroically defended and stacked its arms. To the great surprise, all the prisoners of war were paroled. The very last casualty, as death in military parlance is described, occurred while we were in the act of stacking arms, and under circumstances of peculiar sadness even for war. The regiment was in line in front of the works, standing at attention and waiting orders, when a detail of men were gathering up the guns left in the trenches by the wounded and the dead, and placing them in piles on its front. One gun, carelessly handled, was discharged and killed a soldier in the act of surrendering. There was something peculiarly pathetic in such a death, and it touched deeply the grim soldiers who witnessed it. To have survived the dangers and horrors of the siege, to die thus, how pitiful. And this was an actual event that happened. While they were stacking arms, one of the men threw down a loaded musket. It went off, and it killed Private Samuel S. Miller of Company E of the 38th Mississippi. And one of the men in Company E, Eliezer Thornhill, wrote a very vivid account of this death. And he said, he talked about it in his memoirs. And Thornhill said, after we were surrendered by General Pemberton to General Grant of the Federal Army, orders were issued to gather up all of the loose guns that were lying in ditches and stack them up. We had marched 8 or 10 paces beyond our fortifications and were arranging our guns. Miller was touching me on my right and a man on the right of him. His name I have forgotten. The first gun that Lewis Guy threw up on the fortress was an old musket loaded with buckshot. The hammer in striking the hard clay caused it to explode, and 6 or 7 shot entered Miller between the shoulders, making a slight wound in the flesh. Miller turned around and inquired who did it, and never again uttered a word. He began to fall, and I saw the blood beginning to flow from his mouth. We held him, and soon life was extinct. I was one of the detail that helped to bury him. And this was a bad ending to a very difficult campaign for the 38th Mississippi. The men had fought very well in the trenches during the siege, but they had paid a very dear price for their stubborn defense. An examination of the compiled service records of the regiment showed that the 38th Mississippi's death toll at Vicksburg was 43 men killed, and in addition they had 32 enlisted men and 5 officers wounded, including Colonel Preston Brent, the commander of the 38th Mississippi. In fact, the 38th Mississippi had the second highest casualties of any Confederate unit at the siege of Vicksburg. The only regiment that had higher casualties was the unit just to their left, the 3rd Louisiana. And when the siege of Vicksburg ended, James Henry Jones signed his parole, and then after a few days, the regiment, along with all the others, were allowed to march out of Vicksburg. And after a few short months at home on parole, the men were declared exchanged, and they were ordered back to parole camps where they were going to be reorganized and put back into the fight. And the 38th Mississippi would see a lot more hard action in the remaining 2 years of the war. One of their bloodiest fights would be at the Battle of Harrisburg, Mississippi, July 14th, 1864. And this was going to be a particularly tragic battle for Captain Jones. He himself was wounded in both legs and was lucky to have survived. Unfortunately, his 2 younger brothers, who were also in his company, did not survive. They were both killed in the battle, leaving Jones the only surviving son of his family. Captain Jones, however, did recover from his wounds and did return to the regiment before the war ended and was promoted to lieutenant colonel of the 38th Mississippi, which rank he held for the few remaining months of the war. And after the war, James Henry Jones returned home to Woodville. He had a very successful career as a lawyer and a politician. He was elected to the state senate in 1890, and he was eventually elected lieutenant governor of Mississippi, serving from 1896 to 1900. And in fact, his family had this marker and relief of him put up in the Vicksburg National Military Park near the spot that the 38th Mississippi held during the siege. But when he passed away on December 10th, 1911, the Woodville Republican praised him as, quote, a living example of the gentleman of the old school, a type that is fast passing from us. In him were combined those gentlemanly and courteous manners, high ideals, and generous hospitality which were always found in the true Southern gentleman of antebellum days. And I've just touched on some of the highlights of the rank and file at Vicksburg. You really should read the entire work because it's very well written and really gives you a good sense of what it was like to be an enlisted or to be a regimental soldier in the siege, in the trenches during the siege. And fortunately, it has been digitized. It's available. The title of the article is "The Rank and File at Vicksburg." It's in the Publications of the Mississippi Historical Society, Volume 7, and it is available online at hathitrust.org. That's hathitrust.org. If you just go to that website and put in Publications of the Mississippi Historical Society, Volume 7. You can pull it up and read the entire thing. You can even download it as a PDF. And I highly recommend doing that because it really is it's a worthwhile read if you're interested in the Siege of Vicksburg. And this brings this episode to a close. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. I plan on over the next few months as we go along, get into 2022, going over some of my other favorite reminiscences, letters, and diaries by Mississippians during the war. And so if there's anything specific you would like to see, let me know, and I'll try and incorporate it into one of the episodes. But thank you so much for watching.